Long before anyone ever worried about deadlines, notifications, or whether they'd remembered to lock the front door, the world moved at a slower, quieter pace. Night fell without streetlights, morning arrived without alarms, and history, vast, intimate, and endlessly human, existed only in memory, breath, and firelight. Imagine a time when nothing was written down, not because people were forgetful, but because the world itself remembered for them. Mountains held stories in their shadows. Rivers carried news from faraway lands. And the sky, sprawling and star-heavy, served as the oldest library of all. This was the lost world before written history, a world without footnotes or textbooks, a world known through hands pressed into stone, pigments blown across cave walls, and voices murmuring stories meant to be remembered, not by ink, but by heart. Tonight we return there, not in a rush, not with urgency, but slowly, gently, like easing back into a familiar dream. In this world, time did not tick, it breathed. The earliest humans did not measure their days in hours. They measured them in warmth and hunger, in light and darkness, in the long arc of seasons that came and went like trusted friends. Winter was not a date on a calendar, it was a feeling in the bones. Summer was not announced, it arrived on bare feet and buzzing air. And when the sun slipped behind the horizon, darkness was not an enemy, it was a companion. Around small fires, flames licking upward like curious spirits, people gathered. The fire was more than heat. It was protection, comfort, and theatre. Shadows danced on stone walls, stretching arms and bending faces into something magical, something almost alive. It's not hard to imagine how stories were born there, half in laughter, half in awe. Someone would speak. Someone always did. Perhaps an elder with a voice worn smooth by years of storytelling. Perhaps a young hunter eager to impress. Perhaps a grandmother who had seen enough winters to know which stories mattered most. They spoke of animals that were cleverer than they looked, of ancestors who crossed impossible distances, of spirits that lived in rocks, trees, and thunder. No one interrupted. There were no phones to check. The fire demanded attention, and so did the voice. And when the story ended, it didn't disappear. It settled into memory, shared and reshaped each time it was told again. Long before books, this was how knowledge traveled, softly, person to person, breath to ear. If you were to wander farther back, deeper into prehistory, you would find a moment when humans did something extraordinary. They made a mark that wasn't accidental, a line that wasn't just a scratch, a shape that meant something. This moment did not arrive with trumpets. It likely happened quietly. Someone picked up a piece of charcoal from a fire. Someone pressed a hand against stone. Someone noticed that color could stay. Cave walls became the first storytellers who never forgot. In places that would someday be called France, Spain, Indonesia, and beyond, humans painted animals with astonishing care. Bison mid-stride, horses with arched necks, lions that seemed to move when the torchlight flickered. These were not childish doodles. These were careful, deliberate acts. And here's the part that often surprises modern minds. These artists were not primitive in the way the word is sometimes used. They understood movement, perspective, rhythm. They chose curves in the rock to give bodies depth. They layered images, returned again and again, refining their work. These caves were not art galleries in the modern sense. They were something deeper, something closer to ritual. Some were hard to reach. Deep tunnels, narrow passages, spaces that required crawling by torchlight. You didn't wander into them by accident. You went with intention, with reverence. Perhaps the paintings were meant to honor animals that sustained them. Perhaps they were part of hunting rituals, hopes made visible. Perhaps they were stories, scenes from a shared imagination. Or perhaps they were all of these at once. The truth is, we don't know. And there's something oddly comforting about that. Not knowing leaves room for wonder. As centuries passed, then millennia, these images accumulated, layers upon layers of meaning. Each generation adding something, learning something, remembering something. Without writing, memory became sacred. Forgetting was dangerous. Remembering was survival. Children learned not from instruction manuals, but from watching. How to chip stone just right. How to read animal tracks. How to know when weather was turning, not by forecast, but by smell and sound and instinct. And when mistakes were made, lessons were learned quickly. Nature was a strict teacher, but a fair one. Somewhere along the way, humans began to bury their dead with care. Not hurriedly, not casually, with intention. Bodies were placed gently, sometimes adorned with ochre, beads, tools, or flowers. These were not practical gestures. They were emotional ones. They suggest something profound. Humans were thinking beyond the moment, beyond the visible. They were imagining continuity. Perhaps they believed the dead traveled somewhere else. Perhaps they believed they lingered. Perhaps they believed they became part of the land itself. Whatever the belief, it required imagination, and imagination is the seed of myth. This was the quiet birth of the myth-making mind. Myths didn't arrive fully formed. They grew slowly, like roots beneath the soil. A story told to explain thunder, a tale to make sense of death, a name given to the sun, the moon, the animals that seemed wiser than humans gave them credit for. These myths were not lies. They were frameworks, ways of understanding a vast, unpredictable world. And they were told gently, because gentleness helps memory stick. It's worth pausing here to appreciate something remarkable. Without writing, without cities, without clocks, humans still managed to pass knowledge across tens of thousands of years. Skills survived, stories endured, art remained. This required trust, community, listening. If someone fell asleep during a story, no one scolded them. Falling asleep meant you felt safe, and safety was everything. In the lost world before written history, sleep was not something to conquer or optimize. It was part of the rhythm. The body knew when it was time. The fire burned low. Voices softened. Stars wheeled slowly overhead, entirely unconcerned with human affairs. And tomorrow, if the weather allowed, if fortune was kind, the story would continue. In the next part, we will wander farther into this world. We'll follow humans as they move across continents, carrying stories with them. We'll explore how memory became map and myth became compass. But for now, it's enough to rest here, at the edge of the firelight, where history hums softly and the night listens. When morning came in the lost world before written history, it did not arrive with urgency. Light seeped slowly into the sky, pale and patient, as if even the sun understood there was no need to rush. People woke when their bodies were ready. Dreams loosened their grip naturally, fading into memory like mist lifting from a river. And then, quietly, life began again. One of the great truths about early humanity is this: they moved. Not hurriedly, not aimlessly, but steadily, following rhythms older than thought itself. They followed animals. They followed water. They followed seasons that whispered when it was time to go and when it was time to stay. The earth, at that time, was an unwritten map. No borders, no road signs, no place names carved into stone. Yet people knew where they were going. They knew because memory lived in their feet. Paths were not drawn. They were worn. A bend in a river meant something. A cluster of stones meant something else. A mountain seen from the right angle told you how close you were to safety. Knowledge was not abstract. It was physical. It lived in muscles and breath. Children learned roots the way they learned stories, by repetition, by walking them again and again, by hearing elders say, "Not this way yet," or "We turn when the stars look like this." And the stars, of course, were always there. The night sky was the first great teacher of orientation. Without light pollution, it stretched endlessly, a slow-turning ceiling of patterns and promise. Certain stars rose when certain animals migrated. Certain constellations signaled cold or warmth, abundance or scarcity. Long before telescopes, humans noticed these things. Not as scientists exactly, but as attentive listeners. They told stories about the sky, because stories are easier to remember than instructions. A hunter might forget a list of star positions, but they would remember the tale of a great animal chasing another across the heavens. They would remember where it paused, where it disappeared, and when it returned. In this way, myth became a tool, not fantasy, but function wrapped in beauty. As humans spread across continents, out of Africa into Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, they carried these stories with them. But the stories changed, slowly, like accents in a language. A river replaced a desert. A bison replaced an antelope. The heart of the story remained, even as the details adapted. This adaptability was one of humanity's quiet strengths. Imagine a small group crossing land that had never known human footsteps. Ice in the distance, wind sharp enough to bite, the landscape vast and indifferent. No signposts, no reassurance. And yet, they moved forward. They trusted that others before them had done the same, even if those others lived only in story, even if their names had long been forgotten. In some places, they left behind stone tools, carefully shaped, balanced just right. These tools tell us more than they seem to at first glance. They tell us about planning, about patience, about hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Making a stone blade is not easy. It requires foresight, precision, and calm. You cannot rush it. Strike too hard and the stone shatters. Strike too softly and nothing happens. It's a skill learned over years, passed down without manuals or diagrams. A teacher sits beside a learner. They demonstrate. They guide. They correct. No words are necessary. Along these journeys, people encountered new animals, new dangers, new wonders. Giant kangaroos in ancient Australia, mammoths on icy plains, forests so dense the light barely touched the ground. Each encounter added something to the collective memory, and memory, over time, became tradition. There were rules, though they were rarely written or spoken outright. You did not waste meat. You did not disrespect the animals that gave their lives. You shared food because someday you might be the one in need. You listened to elders, not because they demanded obedience, but because survival had taught them things youth could not yet know. These rules were often wrapped in stories, a tale about a hunter who took more than he needed and suffered misfortune, a story about an animal spirit that punished arrogance. These were not threats. They were reminders softened by narrative. It's easy to imagine these stories being told while walking. Long journeys invite conversation. Silence, too, but also the gentle passing of tales to keep the mind occupied and the pace steady. And sometimes there was laughter. Yes, even in a world without writing, humor thrived. Someone tripped over a root. Someone misjudged the weather. Someone claimed they could outrun an animal that clearly proved them wrong. These moments became stories too, retold with embellishment and affectionate exaggeration. Humans have always laughed at themselves. It's one of the ways we stay human. As groups settled temporarily near rivers, coastlines, fertile valleys, they developed deeper relationships with specific places. Certain rocks became landmarks, certain trees became meeting points, certain caves became sanctuaries, and with familiarity came ritual. Ritual didn't require temples or priests. It emerged naturally from repetition and meaning. A successful hunt followed by a shared meal. A seasonal gathering when food was abundant. A quiet moment before a journey, acknowledging the unknown. Sometimes these rituals involved sound, rhythmic clapping, drumming, chanting. Sound carries far. It binds people together. It slows the breath. It makes time feel different. Sometimes they involved movement, dance, sway, mimicry of animals. These were not performances. They were expressions, ways of aligning the body with the world around it. And sometimes ritual involved silence. Silence, after all, was plentiful. There were no engines, no constant hum of electricity, just wind, water, insects, and the occasional distant call of an animal. In such quiet, thoughts stretched out. Imagination had room to wander. This is where myths deepened. A storm was no longer just weather. It had intention. A river was not just water. It was a being with moods. The land itself felt alive, responsive. This worldview did not separate humans from nature. It placed them inside it. And when people moved on, as they always did, eventually, they carried that sense of connection with them. They left behind footprints that faded, camps that returned to Earth, and stories that traveled on. By the time humans reached the far edges of the continents, they were already ancient storytellers. Their past stretched back further than memory could reach. Yet somehow, enough remained intact. Enough to teach, enough to warn, enough to wonder. As night fell again on this unwritten earth, travelers gathered once more. Fires were lit, food was shared. The day's journey was folded into the long tapestry of human experience. And somewhere in the telling of a familiar story, one told many times before, someone listened with half-closed eyes. The rhythm of the voice, the crackle of the fire, the certainty that tomorrow would come, all of it blended into something deeply comforting. The world was vast, the path was long. But for now, there was rest. In the next part, we will step inside the caves and rituals more deeply. We'll explore how symbols began to speak, how images became memory anchors, and how humans started to think not just about survival, but about meaning. For now, let the footsteps fade. Let the fire burn low. Let sleep arrive the way it always has, naturally. There comes a point, somewhere deep in the long human past, when survival alone was no longer enough. Food was gathered, shelters were made, paths were known. And in the soft spaces between necessity and rest, something else began to grow. Meaning. It didn't arrive all at once. Meaning rarely does. It crept in quietly, carried on flickering firelight and idle moments when hands were busy but minds were free to wander. Imagine sitting near the mouth of a cave as evening settles in. The day's work is done. The air cools. Someone feeds the fire, and the flames stretch upward, painting the stone walls in warm, shifting colors. Shadows ripple and merge. Shapes appear, disappear, and appear again. Your eyes linger. Perhaps you notice that a curve in the stone resembles the back of an animal. A crack looks like a running figure. The mind, always eager to recognize patterns, fills in the rest. And that's where symbols begin. A symbol is not just a picture. It's a bridge between what is seen and what is felt, between the outer world and the inner one. Early humans may not have used words like symbol or abstract thought, but they understood the power of representation instinctively. They knew that some marks mattered more than others. In caves around the world, alongside the detailed animal paintings, there are simpler forms: dots, lines, handprints, spirals. These shapes repeat across time and geography. They are found in places separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. This repetition is no accident. A handprint pressed against stone and blown around with pigment is both deeply personal and strangely universal. It says, "I was here." It says, "I touched this." It says, "Remember." And perhaps most importantly, it says, "I belong." To leave a mark in a cave was not an act of ego. It was an act of connection, a way of joining the present moment to something larger, past, future, or spirit. Some caves show evidence of careful planning: pigments mixed from minerals, torches prepared, paths memorized. This was not casual decoration. It was intentional, often communal, and it likely involved ritual. Ritual does not require certainty. It requires sincerity, a shared understanding that what is happening matters, even if no one can fully explain why. Picture a small group entering a cave together. The outside world fades as torchlight becomes the only sun. Sounds change. Footsteps echo. Breaths feel louder. The space itself seems to listen. Someone begins to paint. Others watch. Perhaps someone hums softly. Perhaps there is silence. Time slows. In these moments, the boundary between the practical and the spiritual blurs. The act of painting an animal is not just about the animal. It's about respect, about relationship, about hope. Hope that the hunt will be successful. Hope that balance will be maintained. Hope that the world will continue to provide. Symbols carry hope well. They hold it without demanding explanation. And as symbols multiplied, so did interpretations. A spiral might mean water, or time, or rebirth, or all three, depending on who was telling the story that night. This flexibility was a strength, not a weakness. It allowed stories to grow without breaking. Symbols also made memory more durable. A story told without an anchor can drift. But a story tied to an image, a painted bison, a carved figure, a marked stone, has somewhere to land. These images became memory hooks, teaching tools, emotional signposts. Children would have asked questions. Why is that animal painted there? Who made that hand? What does this mark mean? The answers were probably never the same twice, and that was fine, because the point was not precision. The point was participation. Through these shared interpretations, early humans practiced something essential: collective meaning-making. They learned to see the world not just as individuals, but as part of a thinking, remembering group. And in doing so, they took another step toward myth. Myths are not just stories about gods or heroes. At their core, myths are explanations that feel true, even when they cannot be proven. They provide shape to uncertainty. They make the invisible feel familiar. In the firelight, as the day's tasks faded into rest, myths found fertile ground. Someone might tell a story about how the animals agreed to give themselves to humans as long as they were honored. Someone else might speak of a time when humans and animals spoke the same language. Someone might warn of spirits that punished disrespect. These stories weren't enforced with rules or laws. They were reinforced with emotion, fear, gratitude, wonder. And emotion is an excellent teacher. As myths accumulated, certain figures likely emerged. Tricksters, teachers, shapeshifters. Characters who bent rules, tested boundaries, and revealed consequences. These figures appear in mythologies all over the world, even in cultures separated by oceans. Why? Because human psychology hasn't changed much. We learn best from stories that reflect our own contradictions. The trickster makes mistakes so we don't have to. The hero fails before succeeding. The wise elder knows when not to speak. These archetypes were born long before they had names. It's also during this long, unwritten era that humans began to wonder more deeply about origins. Where did we come from? Why is the world the way it is? What happens when we die? Without science as we know it, these questions were answered with narrative, with metaphor, with symbols that could hold complexity without collapsing under it. A mountain might be the body of a giant. A river might be a path between worlds. Death might be a journey, not an ending. These ideas were not escapism. They were comfort. In a world where life was fragile, comfort mattered. And so, as nights passed and fires burned down to embers, humans practiced a kind of gentle philosophy. They didn't debate abstract concepts. They told stories. They listened. They nodded. They slept. Sleep, in this context, was not separate from learning. Dreams were considered meaningful. They were discussed, shared, interpreted. A dream about an animal might be seen as a message. A dream about water might be a warning. The line between waking life and dreaming was softer, more porous, and perhaps that made rest deeper. Because when the world feels meaningful, even its mysteries feel less threatening. As this part of our journey comes to a close, imagine the cave growing quiet. The fire dims. The last story trails off. Outside, the stars hold their positions, steady and ancient. Inside, symbols linger on stone, waiting for the next set of eyes, the next interpretation, the next generation. In the next part, we will meet the early mythmakers more closely. We'll explore how certain stories became sacred, how oral tradition preserved astonishing detail, and how the human voice became the most powerful archive of all. For now, let the symbols rest. Let the fire cool. Let sleep come softly, carrying images that don't need explanation. At some point in every long human story, certain voices begin to stand out. Not because they are louder, but because they remember more. Not because they command attention, but because people naturally lean in when they speak. These were the first keepers of memory. They did not wear special clothing or carry symbols of authority. There were no titles carved into wood or stone. And yet, when they began to speak, others listened with a particular kind of stillness. These were the ones who remembered the old stories accurately, the ones who could trace family lines back further than anyone else, the ones who knew which tale to tell when a child was afraid, and which warning to repeat when arrogance crept in. They were not historians in the modern sense. They were living archives. In a world without writing, memory was not just personal, it was communal. and those who demonstrated an unusual ability to remember became invaluable. Their minds held migrations, seasons, disasters, triumphs, and mistakes. To forget these things was to risk repeating them. So memory was honored, but it was also trained. Stories were not told casually when they mattered. Important narratives followed patterns. Repetition was intentional. Phrases were reused. Rhythms were established. These techniques made stories easier to remember and harder to distort. It's the same reason songs stick in the mind long after conversations fade. Some stories were told only at certain times of year, some only in certain places, some only by certain people. This wasn't about secrecy. It was about respect and accuracy. Context matters when memory is fragile. Imagine a long winter night. Food stores are carefully rationed. The cold presses in. This is when the deep stories are told, not just to pass time, but to reinforce identity, to remind everyone who they are, where they came from, and why they endure. A storyteller might begin slowly, with a familiar opening. The listeners already know what's coming, but they listen anyway. Familiarity is comforting. It allows the mind to relax, to sink into the rhythm. And yet, each telling is slightly different. A pause here, a gesture there, a detail emphasized because of something that happened recently. The story breathes. These oral traditions were remarkably resilient. Some scholars believe certain stories may have preserved memories of real events. Volcanic eruptions, floods, coastlines changing across thousands of years. Not as dates or data, but as narrative. A tale of land swallowed by water, a story of fire falling from the sky, a warning about places not to return to. Encoded in myth, memory survived. The keepers of memory understood something modern societies sometimes forget. Facts alone are not enough. To endure, knowledge must matter emotionally. And so they wrapped information in story. They braided caution with wonder. They made learning feel like belonging. These storytellers were not always elders, though age helped. Sometimes they were people who had experienced something extraordinary. A long journey, a close call with death, a powerful dream. Experience added weight to words. And over time, some of these figures began to take on a special role, not as rulers, but as interpreters. Interpreters of dreams, of omens, of symbols painted long ago by hands no one remembered. They helped connect the present to the past and the visible to the invisible. This was the slow emergence of the mythmaker as a cultural role, not a job, a calling. Mythmakers did not invent stories from nothing. They listened, they observed, they gathered fragments from many voices and shaped them into something that could be shared. They noticed patterns, how certain themes returned, how certain mistakes were always punished in stories, how certain virtues, generosity, humility, courage were consistently rewarded. They understood that stories could guide behavior without force. In this way, myth was not just entertainment. It was ethics, memory, and identity woven together. As human groups grew larger and more complex, these shared narratives became even more important. They helped maintain cohesion. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves. When disagreements arose, as they always do, stories provided a neutral ground. Instead of arguing directly, someone might tell a familiar tale whose lesson was clear enough for everyone to recognize. No confrontation necessary. There was wisdom in this indirectness. It preserved harmony, and harmony mattered. Life was unpredictable. Illness, injury, weather, animals, any of these could disrupt everything. Social cohesion was a form of protection. The mythmakers helped maintain it. They also helped people make sense of death. Without writing, there were no recorded epitaphs, no cemeteries with carved names, but there were stories. Stories ensured that the dead were not lost. A person lived on in the tales told about them. Their kindness, their foolishness, their bravery, their peculiar habits that made people smile. In this way, storytelling became a form of immortality, and this, too, was comforting. Children grew up hearing about ancestors they would never meet. These figures felt real, present, almost close enough to touch, and perhaps, in some sense, they were. Memory collapses time. A story told today can make the distant past feel near. It can make loss feel less final. As night deepened and fires burned low, the keepers of memory spoke more softly. Their voices were steady, practiced. They knew when to pause, when to let silence do the work. Listeners leaned back, eyes closed, breathing slowed. The story continued, whether they were awake to hear it or not. In the next part, we will explore how these myths began to shape early ideas of gods, spirits, and sacred landscapes. How the world itself became layered with meaning, and how humans learned to live inside those layers. For now, rest with the storytellers. Let their voices fade into the rhythm of the night. Let memory hold you gently the way it always has. There is a subtle moment in the long human past when the landscape itself begins to feel different. Not physically different. Mountains are still mountains, rivers still flow, but emotionally changed, charged, alive in a new way. This is when the world becomes sacred. Not sacred in the sense of temples or commandments, but sacred in the sense of presence. Certain places begin to matter more than others. A hill where the sun rises just right. A tree struck by lightning and still standing. A spring that never seems to dry, even in the hardest summers. People return to these places again and again. At first, they may not know why. They simply feel that something important happens there. The air feels heavier, quieter, or perhaps lighter, as if breathing comes easier. Over time, stories gather around these places the way leaves gather in a bend of a stream. This is where the ancestor first spoke to the animals. This is where the river listens. This is where the world is thin. The land itself becomes part of the story. In the absence of writing, geography is remembered through meaning. A place without a story is just terrain. A place with a story becomes a destination. These sacred landscapes are among humanity's oldest shared ideas. Long before churches, long before cities, people knew that some places asked for respect, and respect, once learned, was carefully taught. Children were warned not to behave foolishly in certain areas, not because of punishment, but because this place remembers. That phrase, or something like it, appears in cultures all over the world, separated by oceans and millennia. The idea is simple and powerful. Actions matter more in places that matter. As myths deepened, spirits emerged naturally from this worldview. Spirits were not necessarily gods. They were presences, forces, personalities associated with elements of the world. A river spirit did not live somewhere else. It lived in the river. A forest spirit was not abstract. It was felt in the density of trees, the way sound changed under the canopy. These spirits were not always kind, but they were rarely cruel for no reason. Like nature itself, they responded to behavior. Treat the land well, and it provided. Act carelessly and consequences followed. This was not superstition. It was an ethical framework shaped by experience. When a group overhunted an area, food became scarce. When water sources were polluted, sickness followed. Over time, these cause and effect relationships were encoded into stories of angered spirits or withdrawn blessings. The stories endured because they worked. As these beliefs spread, certain individuals became known for their ability to interact with the unseen. Not because they claimed power, but because others noticed something about them. They dreamed vividly. They noticed patterns others missed. They seemed to know when weather would turn or when animals would move. They listened more than they spoke. These individuals, often referred to much later as shamans, seers, or spirit walkers, did not separate the spiritual from the practical. To them, everything was connected. A sickness was not just physical. A dream was not just imagination. A song was not just sound. Rituals led by these figures were immersive experiences. Drumming to alter rhythm and perception, chanting to synchronize breath, movement to exhaust the body just enough to quiet the mind. In these states, people felt closer to something vast and reassuring, not controlled, not owned, but present. And importantly, these rituals were communal. No one sought enlightenment alone. Experience was shared, witnessed, remembered together. Again, memory mattered. The myths that emerged from these experiences were not rigid doctrines. They were living narratives open to reinterpretation. A spirit encountered by one group might be understood differently by another. The core remained, but the details shifted. This flexibility allowed belief systems to travel. As humans continued to migrate, they carried these sacred frameworks with them. New landscapes required new stories. Old spirits adapted or merged. Some faded away. This was not loss, it was evolution. Gradually, some spirits became more defined. They took on names, personalities, relationships with one another. Stories grew longer, more complex. This is where early gods begin to appear. Not suddenly, not universally, but slowly, unevenly, shaped by environment and need. A farming community imagines a spirit of growth and renewal. A coastal group tells stories of powerful sea beings. A desert culture speaks of endurance and scarcity. The divine reflects the landscape. But even as gods emerged, they were not distant. They were accessible through ritual, story, and respect. They were not all-powerful overseers. They were part of the same world, bound by its rules. And humans were not powerless before them. Cleverness, humility, and cooperation still mattered. Many myths from this period feature humans outwitting gods, bargaining with spirits, or learning hard lessons through direct interaction. These stories reflect a worldview where agency still exists. You are not helpless. You are responsible. As night settles again in our story, imagine a group gathered near one of these sacred places. Perhaps a stone circle arranged carefully over generations. Perhaps a clearing where the stars seem closer. A ritual is underway. Nothing dramatic, no spectacle, just rhythm, breath, presence. People feel connected, not just to each other, but to those who came before, to the land beneath them, to something that cannot be named but can be felt. This feeling does not demand belief. It invites rest. And rest, once again, arrives naturally. In the next part, we will explore how time itself began to take shape in myth, how cycles, seasons, and celestial movements influenced early storytelling, and how humans began to imagine the past and future as part of a larger cosmic rhythm. For now, remain here. in a world where the land listens, where stories are alive, where sleep is simply another way of participating in the great unwritten story. Before anyone thought of time as something that could be lost, saved, or wasted, it was something that returned, again and again. Early humans did not imagine time as a straight line stretching endlessly forward. They experienced it as a circle, a series of rhythms that came back when expected, like trusted companions who never forgot the way home. Day followed night, night followed day. The moon grew and shrank. Seasons turned. Animals arrived and departed. Plants bloomed, withered, and bloomed again. Nothing was permanent, yet nothing truly vanished. This cyclical experience of time shaped how people thought, told stories, and rested. The past was not gone. It was behind the next turn. The future was not unknown. It was familiar, waiting to reappear. And the sky was the great clock that made all of this visible. Long before calendars, humans watched the heavens carefully, not out of idle curiosity, but because survival depended on it. Knowing when animals migrated, when rains came, or when cold would arrive, meant the difference between preparation and hardship. The sun was the most obvious marker. Its path across the sky changed subtly throughout the year. Days grew longer, then shorter. Shadows behaved differently. Even without numbers, people noticed. The moon, however, was more intimate. It changed shape in a way that felt personal, almost expressive. It disappeared and returned. It governed tides, light, and perhaps even sleep itself. Its cycle was short enough to be remembered easily, yet mysterious enough to inspire wonder. Stories followed. The moon became a traveler, a wanderer, a being that died and was reborn. Sometimes it was chased, sometimes wounded, sometimes hiding. These were not scientific explanations, but they were memorable ones, and memory was the goal. Stars, too, were carefully observed. Certain patterns returned to the same positions year after year. Some rose only during certain seasons. Others never moved at all. These fixed stars became anchors, reliable, comforting. Over generations, people learned which stars signaled change. When a certain group appeared at dusk, it might mean colder weather was coming. When another appeared before dawn, it might signal time to move camp. Again, stories made this knowledge portable. A constellation became an animal, frozen mid-leap. Another became a family gathered around a fire. Another, a great path across the sky that souls traveled after death. In this way, the heavens became a shared memory palace. And time, once again, was wrapped in narrative. As these observations accumulated, early humans began to structure their lives more deliberately around cycles. Seasonal gatherings became traditions. Certain rituals were performed only when the moon was full or when a particular star returned. These were the first calendars, not carved into stone, but lived. They did not require counting. They required attention. And attention, practiced over long stretches of quiet time, comes naturally when life is not crowded with distraction. The myths that grew from these cycles reflected a deep acceptance of change. Nothing stayed the same forever. Loss was followed by renewal. Darkness gave way to light. Even death fit into this pattern. In many early belief systems, death was not an end, but a transformation, a return, a movement into another phase of the cycle. The dead joined the ancestors. The ancestors influenced the living. The living would one day join the ancestors. The circle remained unbroken. This understanding softened grief. It did not erase sadness, but it placed it inside a larger rhythm. one that promised continuity, if not reunion. Stories told at funerals reflected this. They focused less on what was gone and more on what remained. Memory, influence, presence. Someone might say, they walk with us now, or they watch from the stars, or simply, they are not finished. Such phrases carried comfort across generations. As agricultural practices slowly emerged in some regions, time became even more structured. Planting and harvesting required precise seasonal knowledge. The cycles of sun and rain became sacred. Fertility myths grew more prominent. Stories of dying and returning gods, of earth that slept and awakened, of sacrifices that ensured renewal. These myths mirrored lived experience. Seeds were buried and rose again. Fields appeared dead and then greened. Life emerged from decay. Once you see this pattern enough times, it becomes impossible not to believe in continuity. Even hunter-gatherer societies, who did not farm, understood this deeply. They saw it in animal migrations, in regrowth after fire, in the return of warmth after winter. Fire itself was a teacher of cycles. It consumed, but also transformed. Ash enriched soil. Charcoal preserved heat. Flames ended, but embers lingered. So too did stories. Myths were told and retold, adapting to new conditions but retaining their cyclical heart. Heroes often descended into darkness and returned changed. Worlds ended and were remade. Floods destroyed, then receded. These were not fears of apocalypse. They were acknowledgements of rhythm. And perhaps this is why these stories were so soothing. They reassured listeners that chaos was temporary, that order would return, that no night lasted forever. As listeners grew tired, these stories unfolded slowly, predictably. The ending was known, and knowing the ending allowed the body to relax. Surprise is exciting, but familiarity is calming. The best bedtime stories have always understood this. In the lost world before written history, storytelling followed the same principle. The goal was not suspense, but continuity. Not shock, but reassurance. The voice of the storyteller matched the rhythm of the tale. Slow, even, circular. And as people drifted towards sleep, the story continued without them. Time did not stop because one person rested. The circle kept turning. In the next part, we will explore how growing communities and early settlements began to reshape myths. How shared stories adapted to denser populations, new social roles, and the beginnings of something that would eventually lead to writing. For now, imagine the sky turning overhead, stars moving imperceptibly, the moon rising or setting depending on the season. Everything is on schedule. You don't need to keep track. The world remembers for you. There was a time when moving was the natural state of things. Camps formed, dissolved, and formed again elsewhere. Belongings were light, stories were portable. Home was wherever the fire burned that night. And then, slowly, in some places, people began to stay. Not permanently at first, just longer than before. A fertile valley, a reliable river, land that returned abundance season after season. What began as extended visits gradually became something more settled. Villages emerged quietly, without ceremony. A few shelters became several. Paths between them grew familiar. Fire pits were reused. Storage pits appeared. The landscape began to hold human patterns more consistently. And as people stayed closer together, stories changed. Not in their essence, but in their function. In small, mobile groups, stories helped people survive the environment. In growing settlements, stories also helped people live with one another. More people meant more relationships, more disagreements, more complexity. And complexity requires shared understanding. This is where myths began to take on an even greater social role. Stories started to explain not just the world, but society itself. Why certain families held responsibility, why some roles existed, why cooperation mattered more than individual success. A myth might explain why one group tended the fields while another watched the animals. Another story might explain why elders made certain decisions. These narratives weren't excuses. They were frameworks that helped people accept structure without force. When a role feels meaningful, it feels chosen, even if it's inherited. As villages grew, rituals became more regular. Seasonal festivals marked planting and harvest. Shared meals reinforced bonds. Songs and dances synchronized large groups into a single rhythm. There is something deeply calming about moving in time with others. Heart rates align. Breathing slows. A sense of belonging settles in. These communal rituals often retold the same core myths again and again. Familiar stories became anchors in a changing world, and the world was changing. Living close together brought new challenges. Illness spread more easily. Resources required careful management. Conflicts could no longer be solved simply by moving away. So stories emphasized balance, reciprocity, restraint. Myths warned against excess, against hoarding, against forgetting one's place within the whole. The trickster, once a playful boundary tester, sometimes became a cautionary figure. Cleverness without compassion led to trouble. And still, humor remained. Villages echoed with laughter, jokes about neighbors, stories exaggerated for amusement. Shared laughter relieved tension and reminded people that perfection was not required. Humans, even then, understood something essential. Taking life too seriously makes it harder to live together. As settlements became more established, certain locations within them gained special significance. A central gathering space, a hearth used for communal rituals, a structure reserved for storytelling, ceremony, or quiet reflection. These were not temples yet, but they were ancestors of sacred architecture. Walls began to appear, not to exclude, but to protect. And within those walls, stories were told that explained why this place existed, how it was founded, which ancestors first settled there. Founding myths emerged. These stories grounded people in place. They said, "We belong here." They connected the present village to an ancient past, even if that past was partly imagined. But imagined does not mean meaningless. Founding myths provided continuity. They reassured people that their lives were part of a longer narrative, that they were not accidental. As generations passed within the same settlement, memory grew denser. Children heard stories, not just about distant ancestors, but about grandparents they had known. The past felt closer, and with closeness came responsibility to maintain tradition, to honor agreements, to remember why certain practices existed. Storytellers became even more important. They now carried layers of memory, ancient migrations, seasonal cycles, sacred landscapes, and the specific history of the community itself. Their role required care. A mistake in a story could cause confusion, or worse, conflict. So stories became more formalized. Key phrases were preserved, sequences were fixed. Certain stories were only told by certain people at certain times. This was not about power. It was about accuracy. Oral tradition refined itself. And in this refinement, something remarkable happened. Stories became long, very long, detailed, rich with symbolism and structure. Epic narratives were born, not written, but memorized. passed down through careful repetition. These epics could take hours, even days, to tell in full. Listeners did not expect novelty. They expected mastery, and mastery was soothing. To hear a story told perfectly, the rhythm just right, the pauses placed with care, was a pleasure akin to music. The mind could relax, trusting the storyteller completely. This trust allowed deep rest. It's no coincidence that many ancient epics were performed at night. The darkness sharpened attention at first, then softened it. The voice guided listeners gently towards sleep. Even if someone drifted off partway through, the story continued. They would hear it again another night. Nothing was lost. In these growing communities, the first hints of record-keeping appeared, not as writing, but as symbols tied to quantities and events. Knotted cords, arranged stones, marked sticks. These were memory aids, not texts. But they hinted at a future where memory would begin to move outside the human body. For now, though, the voice still ruled. And as fires burned low in village centers, people gathered close. Children leaned against parents. Elders spoke softly. The familiar myths unfolded, steady as breathing. Outside, fields rested. Animals slept. The stars continued their slow procession overhead. The world was becoming more complex, but stories were keeping pace. In the final part, we will arrive at the edge of writing itself. We'll explore how the first written symbols emerged from myth and memory, and how something was gained and something quietly lost when stories left the human voice and settled onto stone and clay. For now, let the village sleep. Let the stories echo softly in the dark. Tomorrow will come when it's ready. There is an edge to every era, a quiet boundary where something old continues, even as something new begins. The people living there rarely realize they are standing at a turning point. To them, life still feels ordinary. Fires still burn. Children still listen. Stories are still told. And yet, slowly, almost shyly, stories begin to sit still. In certain places, at certain moments, humans began to make marks not just to remember symbols, rituals, or presents, but to hold specific information in place. A number, a name, an event that needed to be recalled exactly, not approximately. At first, these marks were modest, simple impressions pressed into clay, lines scratched into bone, symbols arranged carefully on stone. They were not meant to replace stories. They were meant to assist them, a memory aid, a reminder, a support. But once a story can exist outside the human body, something profound changes. The voice is no longer the only vessel. This transition did not happen everywhere at once. It emerged independently in different parts of the world: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica. Each culture arrived there by its own winding path, guided by its own needs. But the roots were the same. Agriculture had expanded. Villages had become cities. Trade networks stretched far beyond what any one memory could hold. Agreements needed consistency. Resources needed accounting. Authority needed reinforcement. And so, symbols became more precise. A mark that once meant many now meant 7. A picture that once suggested a thing now stood for a sound. A symbol began to represent not just an idea, but a word. Writing was born, not as poetry, not as myth, but as administration. Lists of grain, records of livestock, names of rulers, boundaries of land. Practical, dry, exact. And yet, behind these marks lay thousands of years of storytelling practice. Without the rhythms of oral tradition, without the symbolic thinking developed in caves and by fires, writing could never have emerged. Writing did not replace myth. It crystallized parts of it. Some myths were among the first things written down. Creation stories, genealogies of gods and kings, ritual instructions, hymns. These stories, once fluid, became fixed, and here something subtle was lost. When a story is told aloud, it changes slightly each time. It adapts to the audience. It breathes. It responds to the moment. When a story is written, it resists change. It becomes authoritative, final. This brought power, consistency, reach, but it also narrowed interpretation. The storyteller, once central, became secondary to the text. Memory shifted outward. Trust moved from the human voice to the written mark. This was not a mistake. It was a trade. Writing allowed civilizations to grow vast and complex. Laws could be enforced. Knowledge could accumulate. Ideas could travel across generations without distortion. But the intimacy of oral storytelling, the shared breath, the communal rhythm, the gentle permission to drift in and out of sleep, became rarer. Still, it never disappeared. Even in the earliest written cultures, stories continued to be told aloud. Epics were recited. Myths were performed. Songs were sung. Because the human mind still remembers best when guided by voice, and the human body still relaxes most deeply when listening. If you look closely at early writing systems, you can see their origins clearly. Many symbols resemble older ritual images. Animals, stars, tools. The sacred world pressed into clay and ink. Writing did not erase the lost world before written history. It carried pieces of it forward, but much remained behind. Entire mythologies vanished when the last voice fell silent. Stories that were never written disappeared into the long sleep of time. Not destroyed, simply finished. And perhaps that is as it should be. Not every story needs to last forever to matter. Some exist only for the moment they are told, for the comfort they provide, for the way they gather people together in the dark and say, without explanation, "You are not alone." That instinct, the need to tell stories at night, has never left us. Today, even surrounded by screens and schedules, people still turn to stories to fall asleep. Podcasts, audiobooks, familiar tales replayed again and again. We still crave rhythm, familiarity, gentle continuity. We still want the world to make sense, even temporarily. In that way, we are not so different from our ancestors. When you listen to a story as you drift towards sleep, you are participating in something ancient, older than writing, older than cities, older than history itself. You are returning briefly to the firelight. The lost world before written history is not truly lost. It lives in this instinct, in the way a calm voice can slow the heart, in the comfort of repetition, in the pleasure of listening without needing to respond. It lives in myths retold, adapted, softened, in bedtime stories whispered to children, in familiar narratives that don't surprise but reassure. It lives in sleep itself, because sleep is where memory organizes, imagination wanders, and the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes soft again, just like it was long ago. So now, as this final story settles, there's nothing left to remember exactly. No symbols to decode, no lessons to extract, only a sense of continuity. The fire has burned down to embers. The village is quiet. The sky turns overhead, patient as ever. Stories, spoken, unspoken, remembered, forgotten, rest where they belong. And you can rest too.